In 2021, archaeologists broke through a sealed wall at Luxor Temple, and what they uncovered stunned the entire field. Hidden behind the stone was a chamber containing 13 skeletons. All female. All between 12 and 16. All with their hands tied behind their backs. And the most horrifying part? These girls had been buried alive, trapped beneath the temple foundations while they were still breathing. This wasn't a tragic accident. This wasn't an isolated ritual. This was deliberate, systematic. And somehow, it was only the beginning of what Egypt's temple virgins endured. Today I'm going to show you 3 revelations that will permanently change the way you see ancient Egypt. First, the brutal selection system that tore girls as young as 6 from their families, including the purity tests that killed dozens before they ever reached the temples. Second, the forbidden rituals uncovered in a sealed chamber in 2019, proof that these girls weren't honored priestesses. They were victims. And third, the undeniable scientific evidence from CT scans and toxicology reports revealing what really happened behind those temple walls. Before we get to that, hit the subscribe button now, because by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why historians tried to bury this truth for centuries. But first, erase the image of ancient Egypt you've been taught. Forget Cleopatra's beauty, golden monuments, and romanticized pharaohs. Because what they don't teach you is this. Egyptian temples weren't just holy places. They were economic superpowers, controlling nearly 20% of Egypt's wealth. Farmland, gold mines, trade routes. The priests running them held more authority than most nobles. They answered only to the pharaoh, and often not even him. At the center of this power structure was a role known as God's wife of Ammonius. Temple virgins believed to embody divine purity and act as a living bridge between the human world and the gods. Elite families fought fiercely for their daughters to be chosen. It was considered the highest honor. That's the official story. But between 2015 and 2023, everything changed. New excavations using ground-penetrating radar revealed sealed chambers untouched for 3,000 years. CT scans exposed hidden injuries in mummified priestesses. And AI-assisted translation uncovered hieroglyphs that had been deliberately mistranslated for generations. What they found wasn't honor. It wasn't divine service. It was a hidden system of abuse, coercion, and death, carefully masked by sacred ritual. Official records claim these girls were cherished, protected, elevated. But the bodies tell a different truth. The bones don't lie. The chemicals don't lie. And once you see what I'm about to show you, you'll understand why this story stayed buried for millennia. Let's start with the beginning. The selection process that stole these girls' childhoods long before it stole their lives. Imagine you're a nobleman in ancient Thebes. You have 3 daughters, 10, 8, and 6. One morning, temple priests arrive at your door accompanied by guards. They're here to inspect your daughters. You can't refuse. Refusal means execution, not just for you but for your entire bloodline. This isn't a theory. Inscriptions at Karnak describe it plainly. The pure ones are taken before corruption touches them, delivered to the god service by divine decree. Before corruption is their code phrase, meaning the priests specifically wanted girls between 6 and 10. Young enough to break. Young enough to control. Medical papyri from the New Kingdom describe the inspection ceremonies, and they were not gentle examinations. They were invasive, public procedures designed to verify purity and physical perfection. By modern standards, these examinations would be considered sexual assault. And here's where it gets even darker. They didn't select just one girl. They took dozens every year, competing with other temples for a constant supply. Not all of them survived the selection process. A 2017 study of children's graves near Karnak uncovered 47 small bodies, all girls ages 6 to 12, dating to the same 5-year span under the reign of Ramses. Their bones showed clear signs of violent death. These weren't plague victims. They weren't accidents. They were the girls who didn't pass inspection, or who tried to resist. As for their families, historical records show many simply vanished from official documents. No more tax records. No more property titles. Just erased. The message was unmistakable. Give us your daughters or lose everything. And this was only the beginning. The families who resisted quickly learned what the priests were truly capable of. Within weeks, tax records disappeared, land titles weren't renewed, and entire households suddenly found themselves erased from official documents. The message was unmistakable. Surrender your daughters or risk losing everything your family has built. Girls, many so young they barely remembered their mothers, were taken into temple precincts they would never again leave. Their names were stripped away, replaced with ceremonial titles marking them as brides of the god. Families were told to take pride in the honor, even as their daughters were pushed into a life designed to break them. But the selection itself was only the beginning. What followed inside the training chambers left physical traces that modern researchers can still detect. Evidence not of devotion but of systematic harm disguised as spiritual discipline. Once those girls crossed the threshold, the priest had total control. No witnesses. No restrictions. No one to intervene. In 2018, a joint team of Egyptian and German specialists performed CT scans on the mummy of a woman identified as a god's wife of Ammonius, dating to Dynasty 21. Even seasoned forensic experts were stunned by what they found. Signs of repeated physical trauma. 17 separate fractures. Arms, ribs, fingers, all healed at different stages. This wasn't a fall. It wasn't illness. It was long-term, intentional mistreatment. And she was not alone. When researchers expanded their study to 12 mummies bearing the same title, every single one displayed identical patterns. Indicators of chronic malnutrition. Bone density loss from years without sunlight. Disrupted growth plates, implying that their physical development was intentionally hindered. The priests called this purification. The evidence shows it was deliberate physical debilitation. Temple dietary logs describe the so-called cleansing diet. Diluted beer, bits of bread, rare scraps of fish, barely 800 calories a day for growing children who needed far more. The goal was never holiness. The goal was weakness, to keep them too exhausted to resist. Excavations of the training quarters revealed stifling, windowless rooms barely large enough to stretch out in. No natural light. Constant ritual noise from adjacent chambers. This is textbook sensory control, the same methods modern interrogation manuals list as psychological torment. But the physical strain was only half of it. What they did to their minds went even further. Chemical analyses of tissue samples uncovered traces of 2 plant-based compounds in every god's wife, mummy tested: blue lotus extract and mandrake alkaloids. These are potent psychoactive substances. Blue lotus induces euphoria and detachment. Mandrake causes confusion, hallucinations, and extreme suggestibility. Together, they create individuals who become compliant, who can be manipulated into believing manufactured spiritual experiences. These were not medicinal treatments. Temple pharmaceutical logs show they were administered daily under the guise of preparing the girls for divine communion. In reality, they were being chemically controlled. Some still resisted. One mummy showed deep wrist damage consistent with long-term restraints. She was around 13 when she died. This conditioning process lasted anywhere from 2 to 5 years. Years spent weakening their bodies, undermining their psychological stability, and eroding their identities until they no longer saw themselves as people, but as sacred property. And when the priest decided these girls were completely broken, physically, mentally, emotionally, only then did they begin the role the entire system had been designed for. Because everything until this point, the selection, the deprivation, the forced isolation, the chemical control, was merely preparation for a purpose the temples kept carefully hidden. In 2019, conservators at Dendra Temple uncovered something they were never meant to find. A sealed chamber behind plastered stone, untouched for over 2 millennia. Its walls were covered in ritual scenes the priesthood had deliberately concealed. I can't describe these carvings in explicit detail, but what they portrayed were ceremonies later known as sacred unions, rituals the priests insisted were symbolic marriages between the god and his chosen vessel. But these ceremonies were not marriages. They were institutionalized violations, justified through divine authority and carried out under a system designed to ensure silence. And these weren't rare events. Papyrus archives from the Karnak complex record over 40 such rituals every year, at just one temple. Multiply that across the major sites, Luxor, Dendera, Abydos, Heliopolis, and you are looking at a large-scale system enabled by a complete lack of oversight. High priests answered to no civil laws. No officials. No courts. Only themselves. Temple grounds were legally untouchable. Even the pharaoh's own guards had no authority to enter without priestly permission. And the girls known as the gods' wives had no representatives, no legal rights, and no way to report what they endured. Because who can accuse someone of wrongdoing when that person claims to act with divine authority? Some of these young girls became pregnant. Examinations of the remains of several gods' wives show that at least 3 had given birth, one of them no older than 14. Yet temple archives contain no records of infants, no mention of births, no documentation of children ever existing. So where did they go? In 2020, ground-penetrating radar revealed clusters of infant remains buried in unmarked graves near temple boundaries. Dozens, possibly hundreds, laid to rest quietly and without ceremony. The implication is devastating. When these so-called sacred unions resulted in children, those children were hidden, erased, and forgotten. This system was never about faith. It was never about spiritual service. It was a structure of power built on the vulnerability of the girls trapped inside it, wrapped in a religious defense that ensured no one questioned its legitimacy. And if you think death may have been an escape for some of these girls, if you imagine that a few ran away or aged out or were finally released, the truth grows even darker. Because the fate of those who resisted, who refused to follow orders, or who became inconvenient to the priesthood was far worse. Remember the 13 skeletons mentioned earlier? All female. All young. All found with their wrists bound. Here's what the full excavation revealed. They were not buried outside the temple. They were buried inside it, built into the actual foundation walls. And the physical evidence shows they were placed there while still alive. Their bodies were found in postures of struggle. Fingers damaged as if from scraping against stone. Spines twisted as though they had tried to curl up or press away from the surrounding walls. One skull bore signs consistent with repeated impacts against the stone enclosure above her. These girls had been sealed inside the structure, conscious, terrified, and left to die in complete darkness. Ancient construction texts reference eternal guardians, human offerings placed within sacred foundations to spiritually fortify the site. For centuries, most scholars assumed this was symbolic language. The 2021 discovery proved otherwise. What offense justified such a fate? Temple records describe them as failed vessels, girls who resisted ritual commands, who refused ceremonial roles, or whose pregnancies became impossible to conceal. To the priesthood, they represented risk, witnesses who could expose the truth. So they were erased in the most literal way possible, built into the very walls where they had once served. And what of the girls who complied? The ones who survived their training and fulfilled the priesthood's demands? Surely they were eventually released to live normal lives? No. Temple archives show that God's wives remained temple property until their deaths, sometimes serving for 40 or 50 years. In public, they appeared as honored spiritual figures. But behind the scenes, they lived as lifelong captives who never married, never had families, and never regained the freedom they lost as children. This system endured for more than 15 centuries, from the Middle Kingdom through the late Ptolemaic era. It ended only when Roman rule imposed secular oversight that the Egyptian priesthood could no longer evade. And here's a detail most people don't know. Cleopatra VII attempted to challenge this system. She pushed for transparency, for inspections, for civil monitoring of temple operations. Historical accounts note that the priesthood fiercely opposed her for this. It was one of the reasons they sided with Rome against her. She threatened their power. After Rome took control, priests destroyed evidence on a massive scale. Wall carvings were sealed behind plaster. Archives were burned. Texts were recopied with intentional errors. They tried to bury the truth, but they couldn't destroy everything. They couldn't hide the skeletal remains. They couldn't erase chemical signatures in mummified tissue. They couldn't remove the foundation offerings embedded in sacred architecture. The evidence endured. And now, researchers are finally uncovering the full extent of what happened. Current estimates suggest that across Egyptian history, between 50,000 and 70,000 girls were subjected to this system. 70,000 stolen childhoods. 70,000 lives defined by suffering that was labeled holy. And here's the unsettling reality. Many modern Egyptian authorities resist new excavations inside sacred temple areas, citing cultural respect and preservation. But some archaeologists suspect another motive, protecting national image from truths far less marketable than golden treasures and pyramid legends. And Egypt wasn't alone. Parallel patterns are now emerging from Mayan temples, Greek oracle centers, and Mesopotamian ziggurat complexes. suggesting that systems like this were far more widespread than historians once believed. Wherever religious authorities held absolute power and operated without oversight, we keep uncovering the same pattern. Systems built on control, justified by divinity, shielded from accountability. The temples that still rise today are celebrated as masterpieces of engineering and cultural brilliance. But they are also silent witnesses. Places where victims were hidden, where identities were erased, and where suffering was disguised as devotion. So here's the real question. Should archaeologists continue pushing for full excavation of these sacred sites, revealing everything no matter how controversial? Or should certain histories remain untouched out of respect for modern cultural identity? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. There isn't a simple answer, but the discussion matters. Because sometimes the gods created by men were nothing more than masks worn by those who sought unchecked control. And the most unsettling truth? We are still uncovering the remains that prove it. If uncovering this kind of hidden history interests you, next week I'm diving into the Aztec priesthood, the flower wars, and the real fate of the children taken during those rituals. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss it.